If I said to you the word legacy, I wonder what springs to mind. I think when I talk to non-Christians about legacy, they immediately go to inheritance. And their idea or concept of inheritance is financial, and that's financial only, which is not the biblical concept of inheritance. The biblical concept of inheritance is more closely related to legacy. It's more than just, I'm going to leave some money behind to my kids. But we'll use money as an example. So a financial legacy, a financial inheritance is not only do I sacrifice, live a life, to go without certain things so that I can leave some money behind for my kids. But a better, more holistic understanding of it is I also bring up the next generation, i.e. your kids, with a different understanding around money, a different mind framework and understanding. So when the time comes and they actually inherit the money, they know how to deal with it. We might have heard stories of people who have won the lottery and it's ruined them. The second part, the building up, the changing culture, is just as important. There's also a cultural inheritance, and we see this with individuals throughout history who have stood against some injustice, and it might be rights for black people, it might be rights for slaves, whatever it may be, but it's not just fighting to get something changed, it's also bringing up the next generation to live differently, to change the current culture so that the next generation are being brought up in a different way of thinking and living. But there's also a spiritual inheritance or a spiritual legacy. And again, it's not just fighting for an end product to change something. It's also bringing up that next generation to live differently, to think differently, to operate differently. And we see this in the life of Moses and Joshua. So not only does Moses fight for a different future, a different spiritual legacy, i.e. the promised land, he also brings up the Joshua generation to live, to think, to operate in a different spiritual culture, a different spiritual atmosphere. We would say words like, this generation's ceiling should become the next generation's floor. We use things like that, don't we? But this is so important, and I think for a lot of churches, we assume spiritual culture or legacy is the same as church culture and legacy, and it's not. And I think where churches get it wrong is they desperately try and pass on a church legacy, a church culture, rather than a spiritual one. And I think, and every time that happens, I think the church goes into decline, because the next generation do not know how to operate in that same culture. And I think what it may look like practically is you might have people that say, well, God really blessed us in these hymns, right? God really powerfully blessed us using these hymns 20 years ago. I don't know why it would be any different today. Or God spoke powerfully and we moved into this community and God blessed it and people will come to faith and it was amazing. 20 years later, God is now saying, well, actually, I want you to do something else. And we go, oh, hang on a minute. Surely not, because God, you said this. And so the culture that we want to pass on isn't just, well, this is what we've always done because that's what God used to do. But what is God saying now? And a spiritual legacy is maybe more closely related to having a spiritual discernment more than anything. It's the people of God around the time of Joshua. They would follow the kind of the visual presence of God. It's the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, right? For no reason, it would have just stopped and settled, and they would have quickly encamped around the presence. And they would have waited there a week, a month, a year, I don't know. And for no warning, it would have just lifted up and moved off again. And the people of God, without having to talk about it, they would have just packed down the camp and they would have followed, because they want to be where the presence of God is. We don't have that today. We don't have the same visual kind of cues, right? So that's why we need spiritual discernment. And a spiritual legacy that you should pass on is, fight for freedom of the gifts of spirit, but have a spiritual discernment and a listening ear, an understanding mind, an understanding heart to what is God saying, and the boldness to go for it. That is a much better spiritual legacy than trying to pass on, well, as a church, this is what we used to do, so that's what the next generation needs to do. They can do whatever they like if God tells them to do it. But it needs to be what God tells them to do it. And when you're building a spiritual legacy, or you're thinking about leaving a spiritual legacy behind, it has to be about Jesus. It can't be about anything else. It's all about Jesus. You take no glory for yourself. It's about building his name, his fame, his kingdom come. As soon as you make it about yourself, about an institution, as soon as you make it about programs and meetings and things like that without Jesus, it fails. So I pray for the church in the West, because I think it's a big prayer, but I pray they understand the difference between a spiritual culture and a church culture, and we have a discerning ear for the movement of the Spirit, and we have the boldness to follow him wherever he goes. And there's nothing better in this world than building his kingdom rather than your own. God bless you guys. We'll see you in the next video.